Okay. Good evening, good morning, good afternoon, good whatever, wherever we're joining in from today. My name is Allan Ball and I'm the National Director for White Ribbon Australia, the largest global social movement connecting men to women's safety. I am so thrilled and privileged to be joined by two incredible change agents here tonight. And some of them don't need an introduction, but they are going to get an introduction regardless. But before I do that, I must first acknowledge our First Nations people and pay my respects to elders past and present. I am on Gadigal country. I am normally on Kaurna country, but it's wonderful to be here. And I know that Chanel and Seb are joining us from overseas. So thank you additionally for joining. Hopefully it's a palatable time. This year is really important as Australia asks for constitutional change in our referendum, and we must recognise Australia's First Nations voice. We are here today to talk about consent, respect, and young people. It's a significant conversation that needs to happen. What we do know right now is we're in a national crisis. And what we will be talking about today is really sensitive. And I want you to know there is support in Australia for any victim, any survivor, or anyone that's experiencing any form of sexual violence, mistreatment, violence or abuse at the hands of anyone. And we've got a team of moderators in the Q&A tonight who'll be able to provide you with the links to numbers like 1-800-RESPECT, which is their 24-hour hotline to get that support required, and men's referral line for any men that might be thinking about violent behaviours or violent attitudes for them to get support. Over the last 2 weeks, White Ribbon Australia has been drip feeding through our socials a little bit about who is Seb and who is Chanel. And I'm not going to go too much into detail because one of the first questions, and I'm going to throw it over to you, Chanel, to kind of tell us, how did you get into this world? And for those that don't know you like I know you, tell us just a little bit about who you are and why this topic matters to you.
Hi everyone, thank you so much for making the time to be here tonight. It's such a privilege to be here. It's a really long story, but we have way more important things to talk about, so I'll keep it quite short. But I basically posted on Instagram, which turned into a website, which turned into a national campaign, a petition for consent education to be mandated in the Australian national curriculum so that every single Australian has the opportunity to learn about these things, hopefully making everyone safer and helping everyone engage in respectful relationships from a younger age and just improving their capabilities to be able to do that. And then, yeah, lots of work in that field over the last few years. And then Allan and I had the privilege of meeting Allan recently, and now we're here.
And Chanel, just briefly, just tell me, the current state, right? So in 2021, a social media post turned into a movement. In April 2022, the Minister of Education around Australia mandated holistic, age-appropriate consent education in every school, every year, starting from foundation to year 10. When you hear that about your story and how you have mobilised and changed a nation, how does that feel for you?
I mean, to be honest, I feel like that still hasn't sunk in, like the extent that that the policy, the impact it's going to have on people. But it's very special. It was very exciting. It was a very quick turnaround for a kind of policy request like that, or demand, whatever you want to call it, activism. But I think that is because this sort of work has been something that people in the sector have been asking for decades virtually, and the importance of it is clear evidence-based research to show how these sort of conversations and having this education consistently, holistically, being reinforced by outside messages can have such a tremendous impact on the experience of women and children and men and everyone in this world.
And I wanted to say thank you first and foremost just for your leadership and advocacy and your strength and bravery for reaching out and really using tools, modern-based tools like social media to create the change. Because if people aren't going to listen and respect what needs to happen, then let's create the change ourselves. And Seb, hearing all about this, first of all, tell us a little bit about you, but then I'd like you to kind of tell us about your thoughts about what Chanel was kind of created and kind of orchestrated on the shoulders and side by side with so many women and men allies.
Well, good evening, first of all, and yeah, I echo Chanel's words of saying thanks for taking up the time. A little bit about myself. I was a secondary school teacher back over in London in the UK, and actually the way I got into this was very much through Chanel anyway. So it was seeing that Instagram story, and I actually worked in a school in Sydney in 2015 for a year when I was 19, and I saw a lot of these behaviors, and I sent her a message, and then she sort of led me and directed me through to loads of different readings and information, and I started doing more and more within my own school, and then eventually managed to get Chanel to speak to some of the young women in that school, and such a profound effect on them and their ability to seize back control and very much identify with those shared experiences. And then obviously in the UK, we had Everyone's Invited, which took off on the back of sort of the Teach Us Consent movement. It sort of happened in a staggered way, and the impact is just phenomenal. But it's great to see the worldwide effect. It's not just in Australia. Teach Us Consent has reached so many people across the globe, and that's through either connections or Chanel speaking to her friends and getting it spread through both English schools, but also the Australian schools as well. It's phenomenal. And
then what you mentioned there, Seb, is something that I think Chanel also echoed as well, was the idea around relationships. Like when we kind of gather in kind of conventional like-minded spaces and learn from one another, magic can certainly happen, right?
Yeah, exactly. And when you're working in this space, it's all about supporting each other. And I've seen potentially in the UK there are some issues with the collaboration. So it's great to see actually two big sort of names in this field with yourselves and Teach Us Consent working together, because I see a lot of conflict where everyone wants the same thing. It just doesn't align always. So it is all about the collaboration and working together, because this is an issue which is widespread and needs to be tackled together, not separately.
And for anyone that's listening, we are hungry and thirsty for your questions as well. We will get a chance to answer them a little bit later on in the webinar. So please put them on the Q&A, and our team behind the scenes. Thank you, incredible team behind the scenes that is going to give me those questions, and we'll be able to answer some of them, maybe not all of them. Chanel, you said something that has profoundly impacted me, and in fact, I need to credit you more for it. You wrote about the statistics around sexual violence and assault, and something that I've read has really left me speechless, that more girls in Australia are sexually assaulted than they are smoking. Is this the scale of what we're dealing with?
Yes. So also just to caveat that that study came out in 2019, which was kind of before the era of vapes. So this isn't vape smoking, this is cigarette smoking, because unfortunately I think that we probably have more than 20% of people vaping these days. But yes, the statistic is horrifying. Only 14% of Australian women smoke cigarettes, and 20% of Australian women will experience sexual assault and or rape in their lifetime. And I think this talks to a few things here. I think it talks to the fact that when you're a teenager and you leave the house, your parents shout out to you, don't smoke. But do parents shout out to people, remember consent, think about respectful relationships, remember that conversation we had yesterday? Does that messaging get reinforced every single day? It also speaks to mass education programs. You know, that wasn't the case. Many Australians used to smoke, many Australian women used to smoke. We then found out that smoking was not a good thing. There was a mass reallocation of resources towards education. We put, photos that deter people in the packaging. We increased taxes. We had resource reallocation to make sure that we reduced the impact of this health crisis. And I think we need to start thinking about the rates of sexual violence in Australia as a health crisis as well, and starting to employ those same measures in order to prevent that. Because the thing is, the vast majority of sexual violence is preventable. And I think people think that it's just something that's either going to happen to you or it's not. You're going to be in the wrong place in the wrong time, and that's just it, and that's unlucky. But it's really not true. It's a culture that has created and enabled this, which means that we can change that culture so that it makes sexual violence an anomaly.
And Seb, what are your thoughts on that? What Chanel said?
Yeah, I think the biggest thing there is that leaving to a party is seen as the safest thing to do, and the parents are often worried about the route to the party. Like that's let me know when you get there. Let me know when you get there. Let me know when you leave and when you come back. But that makes up 10% of these cases of sexual violence. Like 10% of the strangers, 90% are known to the perpetrator. To the victim. And that's the real issue. It's not walking to a party. It's when you're at the party and these young people do not understand the boundaries of consent. They do not understand, and alcohol is involved, and it becomes a very difficult situation, because that is where sexual assault is happening, is at these parties. It isn't on the way there. It's not on the way back. It is at those parties. And parents at the moment are not worried about the parties. They're worried about the day-to-day aspects of life where they may come across that stranger. But that is the 10%. It's the minority.
And when we talk about what you've said there, both of you have said, is the importance of kind of holistic approaches. And it really is going to take multiple levers to pull, because look, if we could solve sexual violence and sexual assault with one lever, we would have pulled it by now, right? We would have done it, but it's complex stuff. And so let's start off by talking about consent education. In White Ribbon Australia, we recently did a pilot program with young men across most states and territories. And we had 3,000 of those young men submit an anonymous question to us, or a comment, because we asked them about respectful relationships, gender equality, boys' violence towards girls. And what we learned quite quickly, and it's quite a common thread, is that boys are really feeling confused about what they can do to speak up, or they're one person. Can they actually create change? What is the ripple effect they can do? Or actually they're not thinking bad thoughts or acting badly. They're just complacent or silent. And so there's lots of reasons why these boys are kind of confused. But I guess for me, consent education, does it cover the right topics? Should it be including slut shaming, toxic masculinity, sexual coercion, enthusiastic consent, queer sex education? Chanel, what should we be prioritising?
I think all of those things need to be included. I think what should be prioritising consent education is, again, this one, a holistic view at it, and two, the actual real life and realistic scenarios that these young people will find themselves in, and equipping them with the tools to be able to navigate that and those nuances properly. Because I think there's also, if we're thinking about young people and their sexualities, there's often, stereotypically speaking, their peers will be saying, do this, engage in this. This is cool, this is great. And often adults or their parents or teachers will, when they're giving talks around consent or any of these sort of areas, will just kind of go down the lane of like, do not do this. And it's very confusing about the reality of the situation for young people. I think that when I say holistic consent education, I mean we have to address the things that come into play to make it not as simple as a yes or a no. Sometimes it can be that simple, but then sometimes there's other things that come into play with that. So, a 14-year-old and a 16-year-old, there's a massive age imbalance in that situation, especially if you're at school, especially if the 16-year-old's a bit cooler, especially if the 16-year-old's also an older boy and we're talking about a younger girl. All of these things can come into play to make consent increasingly confusing. And instead of, like, I think when you're at school, you get taught that under the age of 16, which is the age of legal consent in New South Wales, which is where I grew up at least, that, if any sex is illegal, it's classified as rape. If you talk about it to anyone, they'll go to jail. That's kind of like the perception, but it's like not accounting for the nuances between a 16-year-old and a 15-year-old and all these sort of things, which means that young people don't feel comfortable kind of reaching out to older parents in instances where things go wrong. So I think when we are having conversations about consent, it is really important to think about how expectations around gender and sexuality are being played out in the situation and what that means for boys and girls and gender non-conforming people differently as well.
And have we got the right mix at the moment? Like, genuinely speaking, your organisation, you're the CEO and founder of Teach Us Consent, and congratulations and well done for the amazing work and transformation you're doing. There's scale here, right? Like we have to get into every high school, but should we be starting earlier? Like, and I'm happy Seb or Chanel to take this one. Should we be in kindergarten? Should we be in primary school? What are your thoughts on that?
I think from it over in England at the moment, they introduced in primary schools and introducing the consent education, but that was very recently. I think the key is the healthy relationships and normalizing the language. It's making sure that these kids understand that talking like using words such as sex and penis and vagina and all these is normal. It's not a taboo subject, and it's getting them used to setting their boundaries even from a young age. And I've known parents who I used to work with who would allow their kids to set these boundaries, and it's getting them used to using that language and being able to identify what is happening to them. And I think that's the biggest thing, because then that will allow them to talk more freely and allow them to trust their parents, to trust the people in their lives. So actually, if something does happen to them, they can then communicate what has happened to them and how it's affected them straight away. So I think it should be, but done in a slightly different way, and more just giving them ownership and autonomy over it.
Also, just to add on that, when consent is taught to that really young age group, like that foundation, year 1, year 2, year 3, primary school, we're not having conversations about sex with these children. We're having conversations, exactly as Seb said, about body autonomy, about seeking permission, denying permission, how to accept rejection is a really, really, really important thing to teach to a child at a really young age, which means that when they do get to high school and they're having that sex ed talk where everyone has to put a condom on a banana and they mention consent, everyone has this understanding, this foundational understanding, like, oh yeah, this is what I have to do when I wanted to borrow someone's toy when I was 5 years old. This is what I've done my whole life. And they're equipped with those notions so that it just kind of makes sense and just seamlessly flows into the notion of sexual consent as they get older and are ready to have these conversations.
And I don't know about you, look, it's been many moons since I've been in high school, so I'm not qualified whatsoever to talk about it. But as a same-sex youth coming to terms with my own sexuality back in high school, we had like this 45-minute sexual education session that was very biological, and it was so super embarrassing, and it didn't respect the boundaries and the dynamics that were playing out in peer groups. So I had kids that were bullying me in that same space, and there we are opening up a same topic, a very sensitive topic, and asking us to engage. Overlay with an ethos that we're going to talk about just the biology and heteronormative, it didn't speak to me. So hence I went to other places. So fortunately, I went to places like the same-sex support services that were in my hometown. But a lot of the kids, and I know this isn't just for same-sex attracted kids, it's a lot of boys particularly go to porn for respectful relationship education. porn is not the norm, but they're there, right? How do we open up this conversation?
Yeah, I think also in the UK, it's something like 1 in 2 11-year-olds have seen or come into contact with porn, and it's
1 in 2.
Yeah,
I think it's really similar in Australia as well. I don't know if it's that 1 in 2, but the average age of first access is those early, like, tween years.
Gosh.
Yeah, and so that's the scale of the issue at the moment. And again, it all comes back to that education in like the primary stage. Like, it's not talking about sexual relationships, it's talking about friendships, as Chanel said. And that sort of bragging, or because what often happens, reading the reports on it, is kids will just send round a funny video they see which is pornographic, and they'll send it round to their groups on, whether it be like WhatsApp or TikTok or whatever, and that's how that the people at 11 years old, or the kids at 11 years old, will see that content. And dealing with it is one of the hardest issues actually at the moment, is how we educate young people in recognizing that porn exists and it's there, but teaching them in a safe way that this is not an exhibition of a healthy relationship or how sex normally looks.
And
I think
sorry, Chanel.
I was just gonna, I have so much to say on this topic, honestly, but there's just like a few things to kind of highlight. I think one, porn literacy needs to be, and this is something we like in the most minor way slid into the year 10 component of the Australian national curriculum, but I doubt any teacher's like gonna feel comfortable to delve into it. But it needs to be happening really early on, like concepts about porn literacy, the fact that this does not show consent, how to look at this media with a critical lens and understand that what you're seeing is an exhibition of fantasy rather than any real life scenario. It's not something you should be asking your partner to recreate. It's not something that you should expect to see when you start having sex. And then also I think there needs to be have conversations about the ethics around the industry and the kind of rates of image-based abuse and human trafficking that exist for that content to be available in such mass on the internet. But that is a different topic. But another thing that's hard to grapple with here is I think we also need to start having quite hard conversations about the fact that children do have sexualities, and how do we foster that in a safe way for them. So, for example, when I was at school, it was when smartphones basically came in. So we kind of got out the first few years of high school without everyone having iPhones, and then they existed. But now when I go into schools, it is like completely commonplace for young people to share naked images of each other with each other. And in the world we live in today, the online and offline world have become overlapping. We create relationships online, we speak on the phone, we do all these things. And telling young people these days to just blanket rule, do not ever send a naked photo of yourself to someone, is basically the same thing as that would have been like teaching abstinence to an older generation. We know that doesn't work, and that just leaves people unsafe. And how do we, and this sort of content is actually called self-generated child abuse material, because it is images of that could be used for pornographic content of children. But how do we grapple with the fact that if a 16-year-old with another 16-year-old who have a healthy relationship want to be exchanging those with each other, how do we make those nuances and leeways and open the conversation so that the focus is on violations of consent? Because that is so often what happens. Naked images get shared on to people beyond the intended recipient, and that isn't seen as a problem. The creation of them in the first place is seen as a problem. So it's again having conversations about respect and not having these blanket statements that make you think, I can't get help from an adult from this because I've done something wrong, even if the first act was consensual and the second wasn't. So yeah, that was kind of a leeway there, but it all goes into this thing is if we're not going to start addressing the conversations. It's actually started, Alan, with you mentioning the lack of inclusive sexual education beyond a heteronormative lens. And if we don't provide those services to young people, if we don't remove the taboos around these sort of concepts, if we don't give them the human right of education in this space, unfortunately, it means that young people are going to have to turn to alternative options. And I think you would be an anomaly that you turn to a same-sex relationships help center in your local community. I think most young people would turn to pornography.
And I don't know if you've seen, or our audience has seen, a campaign that was run by the New Zealand government a few years ago, talking about pornography, and they kind of done a tongue-in-cheek approach to it. But what really resonated with me when I watched these advertisements was how the parent played a critical role in reinforcing a non-shameful, non-judgmental, curiosity almost approach. And it was beautifully done around asking an open-ended probe, saying, it's okay. It's time for us to have a conversation around using pornography or what you're doing online. Are we thinking about, when we look at a holistic approach, are we really thinking about the roles of consent education in isolation, or are we at a point in Australia where we're also thinking about what is the role of being reinforcing those messages at home?
100%. You go, Seb.
Yeah, I think that's the key, is the reinforcement at home. We have to involve parents in this. If we want to make any tangible change, the parents are one of the key factors, because you think about the number of hours you spend at school and then the number of hours you spend at home, including holidays. You can learn as much as you want in school, and then you're away on the holidays and you can completely unlearn that. I mean, as a teacher, I've seen that with basic science or whatever, but it's exactly the same. You get taught habits and behaviors by your parents, and they are the positive role models in your lives. But same as your siblings, if they're older or even younger, they have a massive effect on how you see things. And I think to have a holistic approach, you have to involve parents, and you have to incorporate them into what they think should be in the curriculum, how best the schools or whatever community can help the parents actually address these issues. And it's sort of similar to using when I give talks to parents, I like to bring up the positive media of, like, you've got shows on Netflix such as Sex Education, where if your kids are of an age and watching that, which, looking at the secondary schools that I was working in, most kids were all watching it and bringing up examples. It's a great way to approach certain subjects, is you see it on TV and you say, actually, what do you think about that? And it's normalizing those conversations. It's not, because I mean, if I was to watch any of that with my parents, I think I would probably be cringing in the corner and eyes shut. And it's just breaking down that approach and allowing and opening up those conversations to sort of work with this holistic overview.
And what is the role of, like, the system and structural changes, right? So if I kind of like wrap up this conversation around porn, because I think we could talk about this as a separate webinar, but there's a push at the moment around age verification laws in Australia. What are your thoughts or responses to that as kind of a policy change?
I do support age verification laws, but it's not enough. We know that, like, law enforcement is not a way to deter people from doing things, or doing things in any healthy way. I think it really just comes down to consistent messaging and conversation. So again, this conversation at school, but then also reinforced at home at the dinner table, and then in the car before you get dropped off to sport, whatever it is. And what Seb just said is, if his parents are speaking to him about that content, he would be like, please, please, please go away. And so would most kids, but that doesn't mean they don't hear it. Like, just so it's still worth, having. It doesn't mean you need to have the most open, two-way intellectual discussion with your children about these sort of things, but just making sure that messaging is kind of getting across and trying to open the door for that, so they know that that's there if it does need to come back the other way. But yeah, I think people with pornography, I think for parents, the biggest thing to remember is however young you think if you think your children are too young, they very likely could be perfectly old enough and have already seen this sort of content. Because an important thing to note as well is that average age of 11 or around 11 to 13 that we were speaking about is most often accessed accidentally for the first time. And then pornography is made to be addictive and, you know, it's also very unfortunately targeted on lots of like children's gaming websites as ads and stuff like that. So it's made to get children addicted. So the goal is to get to a position where if your child accidentally accesses pornography when they're on a gaming website or illegally downloading a movie or whatever, maybe they're doing something they're not 100% meant to be doing, they can come to you and speak to you about it so that they don't kind of get lost in a rabbit hole at a really young age.
Certainly. And Seb, your thoughts on this to kind of conclude this segment?
Yeah, I think I definitely agree. I think there should be age verification in put in, but that is the issue. It is so easy nowadays. Kids are getting technologically better and better to just completely bytrack these, and if they want to, they can. So you can use whatever tools like VPNs, whatever, to get around this. And so it's the resources available where actually doing more the critical analysis of porn, and actually that is going to be way more worthwhile with the resources that we have. That is what we need to target, because I think porn will always be accessible. There will always be a way to access porn, but it's making sure young people understand to view it through those critical glasses and just pick out why it is not a healthy exhibition of a relationship, why it is not consent, and that would be what I would probably target.
I also just want to jump in here, sorry, really quickly, and
Please.
we'll wrap this up. Just kind of linking it back to the whole point of this webinar, if we're thinking about like reducing specifically male violence against, in general. If we're thinking about violence against women, a lot of mainstream pornography depicts violent acts towards women and girls, like a significant amount. And I think the problem is that this becomes numb to people who have ingested this from a young age as their only form of sex education, or as the only time that anything's actually explicitly been spoken to them about these things in that way. And what that can do is it can deem those acts as non-violent in their mind, which means that when they are older and they are engaging in sexual activity, they think that this is a standard practice in sex and do not do things like ask for consent for certain things. So I think really explicit conversations about understanding that consent is an iterative process, and that consenting to one thing doesn't mean consenting to everything, and understanding the large-scale depiction of violence against women in these spaces.
And I'm glad you mentioned that, Chanel, because it's such an important point. And I think what I'm really hearing around this is that we gotta utilize and deploy every available instrument in our toolbox. So if age verification laws is one of those tools, great, let's use that. But it must sit alongside respectful relationship education, consent education, role modeling, reinforcing of those through adults in our lives. So it's a real reminder about it does take a holistic approach. Now, it's a good reminder that if you have any questions, I said we were thirsty. It's getting on dinner time for some people that are on the eastern seaboard of Australia. So you might be hungry. So please put your questions through. Stephen in the Q&A has asked he's put a comprehensive response in there. I won't go through all of it, but at the heart of it, it kind of comes to our next question and segment around the recent shift in the national conversation around consent, but also respectful relationship education. How do we know that respectful relationship education is making a difference?
We have studies that show it does. We don't have these yet at its large scale in Australia, but hopefully we will, because Human Rights Commission has $5 million to start undertaking and measuring the impact of consent education on school children. But I mean, a good one that I like to reference, because they were kind of like the pioneers of it, but like classic, like it's always the Netherlands and the Scandi countries doing things right before everyone else does. So in the Netherlands, they basically I actually don't know how long ago this was now. I should know how long ago it was, but I think it was quite a while ago. They had a health crisis of high rates of sexual assault, especially amongst young people, and they also had really high rates of STI transmission and unwanted pregnancy in young women. And all of these things together pointed to there's something wrong with the education around sex that these people are experiencing. So yeah, the Netherlands has a really comprehensive like sexuality and respectful relationships education program that obviously focuses on consent as well, and then has really open conversations about sex from like, I mean, if you like YouTube it or something, there's like kids having quite explicit conversations from a young age, and it's almost like jarring, but it's like, well, that's important, like that's what's going to keep them safe. And then basically over a period of years, and once this has been like implemented in whole alongside other measures in the Netherlands, they basically had the out of all high income countries, like the lowest rates of unwanted pregnancy for young people. Like their rates of STI transmission were back to normal or below like standard rates. And they had the average age that first sexual intercourse occurred increased, which means that children were having sex later because they had the capabilities to consent to it and decide whether they wanted to do it or not more. And the amount that teenagers engaged in sexual intercourse decreased, along with improvements to reported rates of sexual violence. The thing with the reported rates of sexual violence is hard though, because when you start having education around sexual violence in the short term, reports spike because of the reducer taboo and an increase in understanding around what constitutes sexual violence. And then they plateau over time. But yeah, all of those things together, I think is just like a perfect example of how possible this is with a if it remains a government priority. I'm so optimistic about the next few years.
Likewise.
I think
sorry, Seb.
No. I think one thing to add as well actually is what we've seen in the UK is that there has been an increase in, so it has seemed like the situation's got worse initially, because when the consent education has been rolled out, there was a massive increase in number of reported cases, and more and more people coming out, and people were like, oh my word, like this has got so much worse. But it's just because they have actually received the education and they've been able to identify what happened to them was sexual assault, rape, or sexual harassment. And often you do see that trend where it goes up and then it does fall because people are getting educated, as Chanel said. And what I always found really interesting when I did these talks was in schools, I would ask them if they ever felt like, or I'd ask them firstly what they thought the average age for someone to lose their virginity was, and then tell them the average age in the UK at the moment is 18 years old. And everyone thought 13, 14, because they all think that everyone else is doing it. Every one of their friends is doing it, and they're being left behind. And it's that pressure where education can have a massive effect. As Chanel said, it results in people having sex later and later because they understand that it isn't what all their friends are doing. It is great in a safe and consensual manner. It's fantastic, and that happens later and later. And I think that's the key.
And we love the Scandinavian countries, and we love UK as well. And you're right, that there are some really good, strong international leads here in this space. I'm really keen, and I'm optimistic around it because we need to bring scale to this. We have over 600 postcodes in Australia, and every one of those postcodes needs to have the same level of consistent education delivered in a place-based approach. But I'm wondering and I'm curious about this, and I've worked in pediatric work for over 20 years. I just wonder, are we tuning in to young men? Have we got that frequency right? And if not, what will it take to tune into young men so they really can understand in a non-judgmental way, a non-shameful way, these messages?
Yeah, I think this is one of the hardest issues. And I walk into a room, and the difference between walking into an all female or female identifying group and an all male group is incredibly different. The brashness that you're met with from the male group and the faces is pretty terrifying at points, I think, because you have no idea what they're thinking. They know that they feel, oh, it's a talk and consent. Okay, I'm just going to shut down. This doesn't apply to me. This isn't going to make my life better. It's only going to make it worse. Whereas, and what I initially do is I basically lay it all out, and I'm not perfect. I've done things in my life which I regret massively, and I lay out personal experiences saying there is no such thing as the perfect guy, perfect person, and making them realize that consent and healthy relationships will save your life. It will either fundamentally make you more open to the strong personalities in your life, and when you're going through mental health issues, you have someone that you can call upon, and you set up those foundations and that healthy relationship to be able to rely and trust them. And that is all leads back to consent. And it's all about onboarding them in a way that benefits them, and especially young men in schools. And what I found is that a lot of the time they are quite selfish, and you are back then. You think about yourselves because you've got so many things in your life, especially now with TikTok and social media, and there's popularity, that you panic about all these things, and so you are self-centered, and it's almost seeing what they can get out of this, which can benefit them, is sort of one of the biggest aims that I've tried to bring in, is bring them along for the ride and showing them how beneficial consent is for them as well as the people around them.
Seb, just help me understand that about social media, because it's a really important point. Like, so TikTok and, oh my gosh, I'm going to age myself incredibly poorly now, so I've completely embarrassed myself. But just help me understand about social media. Is it positive? Is it negative? Is it neutral? What is it?
I think social media has some very positive aspects to it, but there was a golden era, I think, and now it's slightly tipped to having a negative approach where they create these echo chambers, and it doesn't take much to research, where you type in something. I'll take, for instance, everything to do with Andrew Tate, and if a boy types in Andrew Tate and watches that, then all he'll get is those themes coming through the whole time, and that's the echo chamber going through. You'll see in the comments that constant recycling of this content, and that's basically going to inundate all his themes all on social media. It will take over completely, and that's where you get these people who then discover others who think the same, and that's where social media starts to unravel.
And not a day goes by where I don't hear the likes of that individual. So he has some influence. But Chanel, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, I want to jump in there. So the biggest challenge to reducing male violence is onboarding young boys, because technically, if it was all hands on deck from the whole of society, in a generation, we could almost eliminate like the majority of the cultural aspect of this sort of violence. But I think it's so hard to have this sort of conversation. Like it's a really weird situation where it's like, okay, the reality is that 97% of rapists in Australia are men, and of that 3%, 50% of those women co-offend with a man. So usually they're being pressured into offending a situation of like potentially a child or another friend or something like that. So sexual violence is a male problem. It's constantly framed as violence against women and children. It's constantly framed as like Women's Day, women's issue. Let's talk about this. This is a male issue. And the thing is, how do we take accountability for that without individuals feeling victimized, thinking, hey, I don't do this. That's not fair for you to blame me for this just because I'm a man. And it's not fair. It's not fair to do that. But what can really lighten that load is if we start taking collective accountability over that situation. If we start, not just men, but everyone, but especially, we really need leadership from men in this space to take that accountability, spread it out across the whole of Australia so that it just feels like a little bit for everyone. And we think, actually, yeah, I did let my friend catcall that girl at the bus stop and I didn't say anything. Like, maybe that wasn't great. And actually, yeah, I did talk about her really poorly after, we kissed at the party. Like, maybe that wasn't a good thing to do. Actually, yeah, I did pay him out for being gay. That's probably really not a nice thing to do. And I'm upholding, very heteronormative ideals there. Just those little things that lay the foundation for which more serious offences of harassment and assault to occur. So it's, it's locker room talk, catcalling, whatever, misogynistic comments. And then it's upskirting because it's funny to upskirt someone on the bus to show your friends. And then it's sending on a nude to someone else who sent it to you because you want to show that, oh, like, yeah, like, look what she sent me. And then it's, using sexual coercion, and then it's violent acts of sexual assault. And then every single layer that we get rid of makes it harder for the layers above to stay there. So if we suddenly don't have any like any locker room talk that's misogynistic towards women, if we don't have any catcalling, then it goes away. And also, I think the thing with young boys and men and getting them on board is, I actually think I agree with Seb often. It's like, I don't need to hear about consent, because if I'm listening about consent, that means that I'm implying that I don't understand consent, which implies that I am a rapist. And that's not at all the true pipeline. What's much more important is I think that these young boys do want to hear this information. I think we just haven't created an environment for them to be open to it. And at the same time, like, this lack of sex education is a massive injustice on young men, just as it is young women, because I know far too many men in their 20s who regret things they did when they were teenagers because they didn't explicitly understand and they were succumbing to social pressures and all these sort of things. So it's a massive injustice that they then have to live with that for the rest of their lives. Sorry, I know I'm talking for a long time, but one last other thing, I want to jump on Andrew Tate while he's being brought up, because obviously he was going to get brought up in this conversation.
Oh, keep going, Chanel. We're lapping this up. It's so important.
Andrew Tate, the reason that Andrew Tate could become Andrew Tate and thrive in the manosphere the way he has is because there were not enough healthy role models for men to follow instead. He came out and he said, things that arguably aren't like the worst things in the world. Work hard, don't, stay strong for your friends, like whatever. And then he riddled that with misogyny and like really problematic views around like what it means to be a man, including like wealth and physical, like doesn't he do like 1 million push-ups a day or like whatever, like things like that. But the reason that was latched onto is because there was a lack of other options for these young men. And then he got spoken about so much and he got banned, and schools didn't know how to have conversations about him. They didn't know how to, teachers and parents weren't equipped to have these conversations that were critical about this sort of content and deconstructing it and understanding why different things are problematic and why it's not why it's problematic to say that women should stay in the kitchen even though it's harmless to say. And there was just a blanket ban on him. And guess what happens when you ban things for young people? It becomes cool and people want to access it more. So honestly, I think in order to counteract Andrew Tate, if that has taught us anything, it is that young boys and men are in desperate need of male role models who exhibit healthy attitudes towards women and life, and still successful in their careers. Cool, like I'm sure they have to be lovely people and do things that you aspire towards, but we need more of those on TikTok, less Andrew Tate on TikTok.
And Chanel, there is so much. Seb and I are fiercely nodding. I'm trying not to nod too much because I've got a wobbly desk. But I see, look, I know we're on a webinar, but I see a national campaign, right? Because the bar for men and boys is set so low, and we've got to collectively raise that. And we know that there are positive male role models that exist throughout our community, and yet we need our media, our social media, our adults, our children, our young people, our teachers, our leaders, our pastors. We need everyone to really highlight and elevate these positive male role models. And it comes to a question that Kim has put into the chat around, how do you involve those parents or carers who are not positive role models? And Kim really talks to the increase of intergenerational trauma, and that we know more and more children who witness violence And I'll challenge that just a little bit. Children don't witness violence, they experience violence and sexual assault. But how do we engage, I guess, those parents that are not necessarily have dealt with their own past traumas and intergenerational traumas and taken that accountability?
I think that people who perpetrate sexual violence or domestic violence or violence against people in the community, because they were subjected to it themselves, is a very different issue to what we're talking about here in a webinar. Someone who perpetrates that sort of violence for that reason will probably not be able to change their behavior from simply listening to a webinar. We need to address this intergenerational trauma, whether that's through therapy, resources, whatever it is. That cycle of abuse needs to be broken. A significant amount of resources needs to be invested into a certain person who either exhibits, those traits, or from a young age, having teachers or other adults in their life being able to identify that they are unsafe in that situation. It's basically a completely different can of worms to this more like normalized, doing it because it's cool, doing it because Andrew Tate said it, catcalling because it's funny, sending the nude because it's funny, it's not me because I don't rape someone mindset. And I think that we definitely need to address that other aspect as well. But the nuance is important to understand that we're not trying to give the same solutions to very different roots of the problem. And I mean, yeah, it's a whole mammoth topic. And to be honest, my work pretty much only orbits normalized sexual violence, and I'm not really equipped to talk to the kind of intergenerational trauma aspect of it and how to start preventing that. But it is also important to understand that the majority of this sort of violence occurs in the more normalized framework, where something like a webinar can make a large difference, where encouraging someone to reflect and take on a level of accountability and have conversations, and encouraging parents to speak to their kids and students to speak to their teachers about bringing in an external speaker for a consent talk, whatever it is, that can have really large communal impacts, which then will also help victims of that sort of abuse, because we hopefully get rid of that sort of like victim blaming narrative.
And Seb, do you buy in here? Because thank you, Chanel, for that.
Yeah, I was gonna just follow that up with, I think that the key there is the breaking the cycle of abuse, but again, it is a different kettle of fish in the fact that you've got the sort of the entitlement side, which is sort of what we're focusing on, and that aspect of the normalization and the rejection, like the dealing with rejection from entitled people is different to the sexual violence perpetrated, like in that respect, because I think what we're dealing with now and the nuance between them is that entitlement, and it is that sense of many of the young men I've come into contact with, they've never been told no, or they've always got what they want the whole time, and whether that's from their parents, or their parents have also never had anything really taken away from them, and that's sort of what we're trying to target, or what I'm trying to target, and getting them to realize and show the compassion and show the empathy towards that type of sexual violence. Whereas, I think the other form of abuse is much more difficult to deal with and change, but it is going to be to do with restorative justice and restorative work, which is going to be a large aim.
And I see so many questions in the chat, and I've got my 5-minute warning, and I said, I'm hungry for your questions, and we won't be able to get to all of them, but there's one in here particularly because we haven't really touched on this topic yet. But I know, Seb and Chanel, you've written about the intersectional lens and how important it is. And so when we have these conversations and approaches around consent and respectful relationship conversations with young people, what are some of the additional considerations we need when we look at it through the lens of culturally and linguistically diverse families?
I think it's such a difficult stance, and I've worked in recently in refugee camps and spoken about this topic, and it's really difficult culturally to deal with these things, because you have to get a better understanding, especially with when education is concerned. You have to understand what aspects are part of their religion and incorporate that, and allow them an understanding and safe space you have to create that within the classroom. And as a teacher, I think that is where the hardest part is when you're teaching this thing, because you've got to incorporate various different things and respect boundaries and respect the faith and the religion, but then also try and teach them as much as you can whilst still being appropriate. I don't know what Chanel's.
I think intersectionality is absolutely paramount to this whole conversation, because we know that First Nation Australian women experience sexual violence at an extremely disproportionate rate. We know that race, class, like religion, all of these things intersect with each other and mean that certain people, because of social categories, are more susceptible to violence than others. And then we also know that these conversations need to be had in a culturally sensitive way. So I think it's possible. I think the way to do this best is, again, if we're going towards a whole of community approach, it means engaging community leaders, engaging religious leaders, empowering them, equipping them, getting them on board as someone who wants to be part of this change and to multiply that education. And then at that grassroots level, at that small community level, that postcode, I can't remember what you said before, Alan, what was it, the suburb by suburb level, with the context of that immediate surroundings. Those people who know, they know the people that go to their church, or they know the people that go to their community soccer group or whatever, they can continue to relay the information in a culturally sensitive way. Just a few examples. I worked with a school in Sydney, Moriah, which is a Jewish school, and I worked with the rabbi in order to create a curriculum that he felt comfortable with the modern expression of how his students express their religion, and the culturally, like the realistic situation that they're in and what they need to know about this sort of stuff, while also keeping in line, his values and the school's values. Also, there's been schools where I've spoken to who, they have strict banner, we only teach abstinence. And I personally don't agree with that, but I will work with that and say, you can continue to teach abstinence and you can teach this sort of content, because you're not telling children how to have sex, you're telling children about consent. And that's only going to empower people who want to remain abstinent to be able to do that, if they feel as though the peers around them understand their own body autonomy and their decision making and their consent, because those are not mutually exclusive things, because abstinence is a choice, sexual assault is not a choice. So all of these different ways that we can engage in these conversations. I think Australia is a very multicultural place. And I think the only way we can properly address that without being offensive or overstepping is to, again, have these conversations with the leaders, the parents, and letting them relay in a way that they best think to their kind of community members.
Yeah, it all comes back to that combining, as we were saying at the start, it's all about the healthy relationships between and working together. This is not and as Chanel said, it's not a woman's issue. This is the whole, all of us in together, and it's something that we all need to work together to combat.
And Seb and Chanel, look, I think on that note, we've kind of got right to time, and I think it's a beautiful way to kind of conclude. It isn't a women's issue. This is all our issue. I know our audience have asked so many questions tonight, and we will get to those. This recording will be available on our White Ribbon Australia YouTube channel. But if you want to continue the conversation, join us on our socials. We're constantly putting out questions, statistics, thought leadership. Engage us, join the White Ribbon Australia movement. And if anything has triggered something in you today and you need that additional support, please call 1-800-RESPECT or Men's Referral Line. Chanel and Seb, we are so lucky. We're absolutely so lucky to have leaders and advocates and change makers in the two of you. I am hopeful I'm so hopeful that we are on an upward trajectory. The statistics here are obviously abhorrent, and it's not the Australia or the world that I want to reflect. And I know when we work together that kindness, compassion prevails. And when we do work together, we are so much better. And so on that note, I wanted to thank you too for your honesty, your candidacy, and your thought leadership and your strong advocacy in this world. So thank you so much for joining us. And to all the listeners who are watching this live and who are playing it back, there's thousands of you who watch this, and I know there's groups of schools online tonight. So thank you so much for joining us. And please know that we'll be doing this again in a few months' time, and we'll be talking more about this issue. So thank you.
Thank you, Alan, and same to you. Thank you for the work you do. You're incredible.
Thank you.
Thanks.
See you later.
Everyone.